evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon, should I say, because it is the noon news at noon. Check all your fingies and check all your watches and check the palms in between, because it is 12 o'clock noon. My name is John Noon, and I'll be your host for this evening.
And I'm Chase Hoffman, your co-host, and to begin this episode, we're going to head on over to our field reporter, Sydney Harrison, for an incredibly dull review of Ronald Reagan's current policies.
Let's go over here to live in the White House.
Thanks, boys. I'm currently standing in the White House, and I just finished speaking with the president. Here's some of his policies he'd like to share with the United States. Apparently, he's completely anti-government regulation. He believes in things like deregulated business, reversing environmental regulations, and less governmental economic control. Speaking of economy, did you guys hear about the doozy of a plan Reagan's cooked up for the recession? Apparently, he believes in trickle-down and supply-side economics. He plans to cut budgets and taxes to reduce the deficit. Along with this, he plans to increase defense spending through the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's a program that could take down Soviet missiles in case of an attack. But the main focus this year for our dear President Reagan will be taking down those commies. Now back to my friends in the studio.
In the future!
When Reagan entered the presidency in 1980, he was met with a poor American economy, high prices, inflation, and unemployment rates. He also had to face increasing national debt. Reagan and his administration believed in trickle-down and supply-side economics, theories which shaped their approach to fixing the national economy. By the end of his presidency, Reagan managed to repair the economy and give the American people the change in policy they desired. His conservative plan included scaling back the size of the government, lowering prices and inflation, and creating new jobs for the unemployed. Reagan's economic policy was based on budget cuts and tax reductions in hopes that these changes would reduce the spending deficit. Budget cuts seemed to do more harm than good, however. They were small and marginal and affected social welfare programs meant to benefit the poor. On the tax side of things, the Reagan administration proposed the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was once called the domestic policy centerpiece of Reagan's second term. It lowered individual and corporate taxes while closing off loopholes that enabled tax evasions and deductions. Ultimately, Reagan reduced the tax rate by 28% through his time as president. Despite Reagan's attempts to fix the inherited economic problems, a recession occurred. It may not have been preventable given the state of the economy once Reagan's presidency began, but Reagan's policies made the deficit worse. The recession was repaired over time through the Federal Reserve's policies of tight money and interest rates. America's economy revived after the brief recession. Some people praise Reagan's tax increases of 1982, while others credit the Federal Reserve's actions for the economic boom. Reagan's defense spending also could have contributed to the economic upswing. A major characteristic of Reagan's domestic policy was deregulation. Ronald Reagan was very anti-government regulation because he believed a web of regulation was hurting private business and the overall national economy of the United States. He had varying results from this deregulation crusade. Success did come from his deregulation of the price of oil, as prices fell immediately after. The reversal of environmental regulations was unpopular, however. These reversals affected regulation already in place that were meant to contain air pollution and potential hazardous waste and have nuclear power plants controlled by the government. In regard to social domestic policy, things are a bit messy. Reagan did not always stand behind civil rights, demonstrated when his administration even backed a lawsuit between Bob Jones University of South Carolina and the IRS. Bob Jones instigated the lawsuit because of an IRS policy instituted in 1970 which did not give tax breaks to schools that upheld segregation. This did not put Reagan or his administration in favor with many civil rights organizations. Reagan's foreign policy was built on the thinking that communism is the enemy and an enemy of communism is our friend. This was essentially called the Reagan Doctrine. His strong foreign policy increased the tensions of the Cold War. Inversely, Reagan promoted American beliefs and ideals such as democracy and freedom to counteract the communist movement. The Reagan administration was hard on communism and made decreasing its influence in the world their focus. Every effort made in the foreign sphere was put towards stopping the communist threat. Unfortunately, that meant Reagan's administration supported some groups in power that were not morally sound. Foreign interference by the United States occurred in Grenada, a small country in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Lebanon. Grenada was invaded by the U.S. to support a government with anti-Marxist sentiments. Pro-American governments were supported in Latin America, and Marines were sent into Lebanon. In order to put communism at bay and protect the United States, Reagan oversaw an increase in our military and implemented the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars, a defense program which aimed to create weapons that could take down potential Soviet missile attacks. This program would be on the ground and in space in hopes of securing a win in the case that there was a nuclear war. The science behind this defense system was ambiguous, and some even say that the technology was merely science fiction.
Oh, I left a bad taste in my mouth.
Anyway, let's go to a word from our sponsors. Burger King. Burger King. Have it your way. From Burger King. Let's go over.
Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. And Burger King comes through again with our all-new Empire Strikes Back glasses. Collect a different glass for your family each week. Darth Vader, R2-D2 and C-3PO, Lando Calrissian, Luke Skywalker.
Buy a regular-sized Coca-Cola at a special price and build your collection.
All new, The Empire Strikes Back glasses. Only at Burger King.
Now that didn't look half bad.
Not half bad at all. Now let's cover some of our top stories for the day. This is breaking news.
As we all know, 86's Challenger accident truly was an unfortunate day in history. Our hearts all go out towards the brave souls who perished that day in the name of progress. Rest in peace. And now for a moment of silence for our fallen citizens. On the topic of being unable to launch things into the air, a tentative agreement on a worldwide ban of medium-range missiles was launched by the United States and Russia. This would later lead to the disassembly of 1,752 missiles owned by the United States and 859 Soviet missiles within the 300 to 3,400 mile range. With the dismantling of so many long-range weapons, we can all rest a bit easier. Don't find yourself too off guard, however, as a volcanic eruption in Washington state has caused $3 billion in damages. The Mount St. Helens eruption in total killed 57 people, and its blast was supposedly recorded to be 500 times greater than the bomb dropped in Hiroshima. An eruption like that must have caused quite a landslide. Speaking of landslides, Reagan and Bush have won their re-election by a margin of 525 electoral votes to Walter F. Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro's 13 electoral votes. Geraldine's running for vice president is truly a landmark moment for the women's empowerment movement. In other news, drama about the recent Olympic Games have broken out, as Russian athletes have refused to attend the Los Angeles Games. This was likely done in retaliation to the United States boycott of the Moscow Games only 4 years prior. Despite the boycott by the Russians, the Los Angeles Olympic Games have still proven a financial success for those involved. Truly, this is a cause for celebration. Speaking of celebration, Martin Luther King Day has been officially recognized as a federal holiday in the United States as of 1986. I believe we can all agree that this is a historic landmark in the history of civil rights. Another good news, economic reports on the previous year, 1988, from the Labor Department indicate a growth rate of 3.8%, the largest in 4 years, and an unemployment rate of 5.3%, the lowest in 14 years. It's safe to say that this economic growth will surely continue in the future with Bush's administration.
Alright, now let's take a look at what's happening across the globe in our segment that we like to call A World at War.
Tensions are high in the Middle East. As we know, since the forces of Saddam Hussein, president of Iraq, invaded Iran in 1980, the two countries have been at war. Iraq has mainly been put on the strategic defensive, not having considered Iran's ability to summon a considerable military force. However, this may change in the coming months as Iran's stream of supplies from the United States have been cut and they are running out of resources to maintain a constant attack strategy. Now, regarding the Iran-Contra affair, After its lengthy war with Iraq, Iran is desperate for materials to arm its military. Fortunately for them, the Reagan administration has a complete disregard for the safety of the United States and has covertly stocked the Iranian military with weapons in exchange for support of the removal of U.S. hostages in Lebanon. This is in direct violation of several laws previously set in place by the U.S. government. The Reagan administration literally armed a military enemy. But hey, Reagan does what he pleases. However, he has not escaped this little stunt unscathed. Charges were brought by a federal prosecutor to his administration, and several members were convicted, including his national security advisor. Perhaps the Reagan administration will think twice before aiding another enemy of the United States. Another topic of considerable controversy on the part of the United States is the revolution taking place in Nicaragua. It seems we will go to great lengths to avoid the spread of communism in the United States. Support of the brutal Somoza regime in Nicaragua is just an example. As the power of the revolutionary group the Sandinistas grows, so does U.S. opposition of them in support of the dictatorial Somozas. With the initiation of an economic blockade on Nicaragua and the National Guard in place on several occasions across Latin America, the United States is receiving global backlash as sympathy for the Sandinistas gathers.
Now that was an in-depth report. Now let's go over to our sponsors with Michael Jordan and the Kids Against Drugs McDonald's team. Remember, just say no to drugs. Let's go over.
I'm Michael Jordan. McDonald's restaurants have given me this time to talk to you about something we both really care about, kids. Kids are the reason McDonald's sponsors their Get It Straight program, a national drug awareness effort. Think about this. Many of you using drugs out there now are under 18. Do you realize that at 18 you have lived only 1/4 of your life? When you're using drugs, you're only cheating yourself out of the chance to find out who you really can be. And believe me, if you don't use drugs, you can just about be anything you want to be. Listen, you got at least 3/4 of your life to go. That's 3 more lifetimes to you. So don't blow it. Don't do drugs. If you're doing it, stop it. Get some help. McDonald's wants you to give yourself a chance to find out all the wonderful things you really can be. And so do I.
Now let's get into a segment that is very near and dear to my heart. One that we like to call the People of History. Let's go over.
During the 1980s, Ronald Reagan had a large amount of control when it came to American legislation. Upon his inauguration on January 20th, 1981, both Reagan and his Vice President, George H.W. Bush, had certain ideas of what the future of America would look like. Nevertheless, Reagan was not the type of man to be swayed from his own ideas. Throughout his presidency, he was an adamant believer in his personal opinion. These things range anywhere from certain economic strategies such as Reaganomics to the policing nature of the U.S. military in several Latin American countries. Specifically, Reagan's central foreign policy had its roots in a very strong personal anti-communist or Soviet sentiment. Ronald had witnessed the destruction of the Cold War, and because of this, he had horrible trust issues when it came to foreign reform and revolution. Specifically, countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Cuba received significant attention as their histories of reform were commonly thought to have been associated with the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Reagan's presidency would be a time of tremendous change. Speaking of presidents, Ronald Reagan was not the only man on this list to make his mark in the Oval Office. In fact, it would be Reagan's very own running mate, George H.W. Bush, that would be sworn into office by January 20th, 1989. Ultimately, Bush's first year of office was similarly conservative when compared to Reagan's, and therefore many things did not change all that much. However, before he received his presidential position, Bush could have been described as a stereotypical vice president. He had experienced constant incidents in which he would have to hold his tongue when disagreeing with the president, and that when it came down to it, he had very little control. In addition, George Bush was openly frustrated with his lack of involvement in the actual decision-making and was therefore ready to make his own choices for the nation. At his extent of power, Bush in his vice presidential position was allowed to spearhead the drug smuggling ordeal in Latin America. During this campaign, Bush would commission both the CIA and the U.S. military to lead drug interdiction efforts in countries like Nicaragua and Panama. Speaking of dirty and illegal operations, Michael Milken's disgusting crimes don't miss this list. In his prime, Michael Milkens was a very wealthy investment banker. He held many ties with the stock market and was even a low-grade bond researcher for Drexel. This led Michael Milken to a creation of his personal design. This creation would be first known as a high-yield bond. Little did the investors of the 1980s know, these bonds would later be known as junk bonds, as the receivers were caught in a large scam. These bonds breached several codes and laws of financial legislation and could have partially been responsible for the recessions and economic issues in America's distant future. However, the real crimes Milkens was charged for was with that of securities. It was discovered that Milkens was dealing his bonds with the use of insider information, which is a criminal offense in the world of stocks and bonds. Ultimately, Michael was found guilty of 98 accounts of racketeering and fraud. But speaking of influential people, Sandra Day O'Connor is not one to miss this list. In short, O'Connor's induction into the Supreme Court was nothing short of a giant step for the feminist movement. It was during Reagan's presidency that the first woman in the history of the United States would be nominated and unanimously elected as an Associate Supreme Court Justice. Although not just anyone can be nominated for this position, before her induction, O'Connor was a well-known judge. She had been re-elected into her position twice before her induction and was known to be very firm but just. With this reputation, it is no wonder why she was one of Reagan's top picks when it came to a seat in the Supreme Court.
Sunday, Monday, happy days. Tuesday, Wednesday, happy days. Thursday, Friday, happy days. The weekend comes, my cycle hums, ready to race to you. These days are all happy days. These days are all chilling with me. Black, gray sky, hello blue. There's nothing can hold me when I hold you. It feels so right, it can't be wrong. Rocking and rolling all week long. Sunday, Monday, happy days. Tuesday, Wednesday, happy days. Thursday, Friday, happy days. Saturday, what a day. Moving all week with you. These days are all chilling with me. These days are all happy and free. These happy days are yours and mine. These happy days are yours and mine. Happy days.
Fonz, tear down this wall. Hey.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Gray sky, hello blue. There's nothing can hold me when I hold you. It feels so right, it can't be wrong. Rocking and rolling all week long.
So I'm here with the man himself, Mr. Tree. I just wanted to see what he thought of Ronald Reagan's current environmental policies and the deregulation of some businesses. What do you think, sir?
Bad.